David Coletto, first of all, thanks for being with us again tonight as our Big Five series continues here on CPAC. Good to see you. Let's focus on leadership. And we can't talk about leadership these days without talking about what's in the public place, and that is the ongoing snc-lavalin affair. The drip of that story just continues. Let's find out what kind of an effect that's having as we go through these numbers you have for us tonight. Let's start with the impressions of the leaders. What are Canadians telling you?
Yeah, so if we take a snapshot, again, last week or mid-March, and we look at all the five main party leaders, what we find is that Mr. Trudeau still has more people having a favorable impression than the other leaders, 35% favorable for Mr. Trudeau compared to 44% negative. 20% of Canadians have a neutral opinion. If we look at the opposition leaders, Mr. Scheer has about the same number who have a positive to negative impression of him. Elizabeth May has 5 points more positive than negative. The NDP leader, Mr. Singhs, and we'll look at these trend lines over time, but he continues to have more people view him negatively than positively. And then there's Max Bernier, who has clearly the most negative overall impressions. 12% of Canadians have a positive view of Mr. Bernier compared to 32% negative. A sizable number still don't really know him or don't know much about him. But given that he's the leader of a party that has one seat, brand new, he's still a relatively well-known figure across the country. So at the very least, he's been effective at getting his name out there.
Okay, let's look at what's been shifting, because you know the title of our series is Trust and Truth in 2019 in the election campaign, and so those are key measures for people, and that's in a lot of ways how they rate their leaders when it comes time to make decisions. Let's look at how things are changing let's start with Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
What are we seeing?
And there's been some change, right? If you look at his trend line since we go back here to August 2015, before the last federal election, you can see that this is really the first time in which a sizable number of Canadians have a negative view compared to positive view of the Prime Minister. I call it the fishtail, right, at the end of that line. And that is almost entirely the result of the snc-lavalin controversy. You can't really point to any other factor that helps explain that. There's only one other time in this whole period in which more people, or about the same number of people, had a negative view as a positive view of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, we saw that was the trip to India.
That was his trip to India. So this does suggest SNC has, if anything, whether we'll talk about ballots later this week, but in terms of leadership, it's clearly hurt the Prime Minister. His image, his brand has taken a hit. And while during the controversy we tracked public opinion throughout this controversy, there was a point at which almost 49% of Canadians had a negative view. It's come back down a little bit. But the question that I think about as we head towards 2019 is this the new normal? Will more people consistently think of the Prime Minister negatively than positively? Because up until now, he's been one of those rare politicians in the world who's been able to sustain a relatively positive image of himself, even if his party numbers are moving up and down.
Let's look at Andrew Scheer. What's happening with Andrew Scheer?
Well, the snc-lavalin controversy has given Mr. Scheer a platform, right, to talk to Canadians, to offer not only an alternative, but to hold the government account. One of the things we've seen is over the time he's become leader is, not surprisingly, these two lines are moving up because more people are becoming aware of Mr. Scheer. The challenge for Mr. Scheer is, while his negative numbers are going up, as his positive numbers are going up, they're not really separating, right? And so there is perhaps some evidence here to suggest, despite Canadians souring a little on the Prime Minister as a result of this, they haven't fallen in love with Andrew Scheer either. And so the more you look at this evidence, the more it tells me that this whole controversy, and we'll get to Mr. Singhs in a minute, this whole controversy has kind of put a pox on all of their houses and raised doubts about political leadership broadly as opposed to one particular issue.
Let's go there. Let's talk about Jagmeet Singh. What are we seeing with him?
And Mr. Singhs has had a challenging time, right? When he became leader in October of 2017, very few Canadians knew who he was. He was popular within the party, well known, but outside of the party, not that well known. Over time, his numbers have increased on both counts as people got to know him. But even in our most recent numbers, more Canadians have a negative view of him. That's softened a little bit. I think one of the challenges, or perhaps if you're Mr. Singhs, one of the unfortunate parts of the snc-lavalin controversy is that it happened right as he was winning his by-election in Burnaby South, right? Miss Wilson-Raybould's testimony came only a few days after he won his by-election, so he really hasn't seen any bump up in his numbers as a result of it. And he is in this unfortunate place for him, if you are a New Democrat supporter, in that he's one of the few leaders who have more people who dislike him than like him, and that's still a challenge for the New Democrats.
Okay, and then you also took a look at, I think, Maxime Bernier, right? Or
oh, not on a track.
Okay.
We haven't been tracking him,
Right.
but we do know that again, Max Bernier is one of the few leaders who has a sizable group who have a negative view of him. I think some of his controversial positions has sort of forced that, but he does have a core, about 12%, who like him and view him positively.
Right. So let's ask about, when you ask Canadians who would they prefer to see as Prime Minister after the next election, what do you find?
Well, one of the things about this question is it doesn't always match the ballot question, right? You'd think, well, aren't they the same thing? But sometimes they're not. And in this case, they're not. So what we still find is, despite some of the challenges the Prime Minister's faced, he still leads Andrew Scheer by 6 points on who Canadians would prefer to be the Prime Minister after the next election. But that's down 9 points for the Prime Minister since December, since the end of 2018. It's up slightly for Mr. Scheer. And then look at Jagmeet Singh. You know, the NDP, as we'll talk about tomorrow, is polling closer to 17, 18%. He's only at 12%. There's this phenomenon with other pollsters that if you include Mr. Singh's name in the ballot question, the NDP performs less well than if you don't include it. So there's something going on.
If you just ask people about the party, they have a better...
More generically, they have a better impression of him than they do of Mr. Singh himself. Interestingly, that Elizabeth May gets as many Canadians saying that she'd be a better Prime Minister than Mr. Singh. And I should point, we haven't talked a lot about Miss May. I'd watch her. I'd watch her numbers, because in the context of all this SNC controversy, as I said, one of the consequences seems to be Canadians are looking for a friendly, honest, truthful alternative. Miss May, in a number of other polls, comes out ahead on who's the most ethical leader, and so there's a real opportunity for the Greens to make a real case, and Miss May to sort of stand out here. Okay,
so then you looked at you also looked at the next set of questions here about personalities, leader with, getting personal with Canadians, and that helps us understand what's driving impressions. Let's look at that. What did you find?
Yeah, so I will say, these are questions we asked earlier this year, so before a lot of the changes that we're seeing, but they're interesting because they, as you said, they go to the personality of the people, right? And so we asked people, just of the three main leaders, which of the following, for example, would you prefer to have babysit your children? And you'd say, well, that's a ridiculous question, David. I've gotten pushback on that. But I actually think it goes to the heart of trust, which is what this series is all about. 62% of Canadians say they would trust Justin Trudeau the most to babysit their kids. Now, again, this was before the snc-lavalin controversy, so it'll be interesting to test these questions again. But I don't think they would have changed fundamentally over that period. If you ask things, for example, negotiate a contract on your behalf, there you find the Prime Minister's gap with Mr. Scheer drops almost entirely. They're about equal. And then that important question about who would make the best CEO of a large company, it's the only one in which Mr. Scheer beats Mr. Trudeau. And it's one, when we asked this question prior to the last federal election, 2015, Mr. Harper easily beat Mr. Trudeau. Now, which one of these predicts how someone would vote, I think depends largely on what the ballot question will be, on what kind of character and personality Canadians are looking for. But it does show that Canadians differentiate, and they view leaders in very different ways depending on what scenario you're asking them to judge them on.
All right, David Coletto, always good to talk to you tonight about leaders. Be back with us again later this week. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Peter.